Well, good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to continue in John. I appreciate Doc leading us last week. I didn't get to hear it yet, but I saw he sent me his notes. Really good stuff. I wish. So, this week, you're back to me. Sorry, but that's just the way it goes. Gary and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about how difficult it is to teach, especially a letter like John, like this. It's even something that you probably wouldn't want to do if you were asked. That's what he said. If he was asked to do it, he probably wouldn't want to do it. Try to cover all of John in 11 weeks is pretty ridiculous. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of useful, and hopefully it's be useful in some ways to you to kind of get the big picture. And I know we're all about studying context. It's just hard not to stop and plant in a lot of these places and spend the whole class on one verse or two verses and one passage, especially with all the Jesus direct teaching in these. And have mentioned this before, but we'll really see this shift in these next few chapters to where it'll almost primarily be Jesus teaching. And so you go in those and you want to just spend a lot of time in each one, and we're just going to say, well, it's kind of like today I was telling Carolyn we're going to touch base on the woman caught in adultery about 3 seconds. That's not because she's not important. That story's not important. It's just trying to select, where to spend our time in. And I do want to do reviews because we're trying to at least touch on each place. And trying to look at the big picture, if you want to call it that. I am going to try each week or most weeks to do an overview maybe from a different perspectives. And so this week I want to just touch base, and it's real quick, but look at it a little different than we did last time when we looked at the first 4 chapters. Last time I was here. And then let me see here. Okay, we started off in John, and as we'll talk a lot about today, much of John is about Jesus' deity. That he is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. Start out in John, and John starts out with in the beginning, and that he was the only Son of the Father. And then we move into different testimonies, if you want to call that, or different places where Jesus reveals himself, kind of a combination of the two. John the Baptist has a lengthy place where he testifies that, yes, this is the Son of God. And then moving along in chapter 2, Jesus reveals himself to his disciples in the end of 1, and then in Cana, when he changes the water to wine. And then we run into where he has a long discussion with Nicodemus. And you could say he reveals himself to Nicodemus. Then we move to chapter 4 with the Samaritans, the Samaritan woman and the town of Samaritan, and he reveals himself as I am. And then we move on, and it's not quite this simplistic, but just in general, it starts shifting more to discussions with the Jewish leaders and some of the challenges there. And then it broadens to just the general public, if you want to say that. And Doc talked about the feeding of the 5,000 last week. And so you just see this expanding circles of Jesus revealing who he is, doing signs, answering questions. And throughout all this, you get this build up, slow at first, but then it really started building last week and even more this week of opposition. Questioning who he is. Who do you think you are would be one way to say it. We would say it today. Aren't you the son of Joseph and Mary? I mean, didn't you come from Iowa? I mean, come on. Aren't you from Nazareth? I mean, the other side of the tracks here. And Jesus, as we'll see today, he doesn't go the easy route on how he deals with these things. He hits some things pretty heavy. And last week, Doc talked about I am the bread of life, which while all the Gospels discuss the feeding of the 5,000, John is the only one that gets into this big discussion afterwards, almost an explanation of that, or you could say they're tied pretty closely together. And he goes into discussion about whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me. And that causes a lot of angst. What in the world is this all about? And even many disciples leave him. We're at the end of 6. So today we'll talk about 7 and 8, trying to hit a couple chapters a week. Hopefully this will work. Plan to do a quick review of 7 and part of 8, and then we're going to spend most of our time in 8. And we're going to have some readings and discussion on that part. Before we do, I wanted to go over a little bit on festivals or Jewish feast. And one of the reasons is John just includes these all throughout, a mention of. It was time for Passover. Passover was at hand, or they went up to the Feast of Dedication, the feast which is next week, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is this week. And there's a lot of mentioning about all this, and there's probably some real deep reasons why he mentions this, but also we get an idea of the timing of things. So I just wanted to real quick, many of you know these, but some of the major ones, the Passover, which celebrated the Exodus and God's deliverance, is usually in late March, April. I'll try to mention the time frame. Pentecost, 50 days later in June, has to do with giving of the law, among other things. Then we have the Tabernacles or Booths, Feast of the Tabernacles or Booths, which is this week. Will come up this week. That's usually in October. And while it's tied to the harvest, it's a time of celebration. And it's a time of looking forward to the Messiah. It's a time of remembering God's provision in the wilderness. And you can see how the harvest would fit into that. This is God's provision as we bring in the harvest. And it's also called Booths because one of the parts of this was you were supposed to take the branch limbs and build a little shelter and stay in that. And it was a week long. And we'll find out there is actually a day added on to this called the Great Day, and that's mentioned in this passage too. Then there's the Feast of Dedication, which I had forgotten this, which is also nowadays it's called Hanukkah. I had forgotten that is not in the Old Testament. That's something that came about with the rededication of the temple. During the Maccabean, so those of you who know more about this, feel free to jump in. But what I read was during the Maccabean revolt, which was a big thing in the intertestamental, in between the Old and New Testament period, a Greek king had defiled the temple. So they rededicated the temple. That became a time of rededication for the Jews annually, and it was called the Feast of Dedication, now the Hanukkah. And then there was a lesser-known feast, which isn't mentioned, but a lot of people think that there's one of these feasts that they refer to is called Purim, and that's in March. Oh, by the way, Hanukkah is obviously in December. We know that's when that is. And then that's in March, right before Passover. So most celebrated the two together, where they would come for Purim and they would stay for Passover. And that's celebrated in the 5th century in the time of Esther, their deliverance. And usually they will read Esther during Purim. Now, the timeline on this, and I'm not going to get into chasing all this down, how I've come to some of this. And some of this could be challenged, but most of it's, I think, pretty well agreed to. In John, in chapter 2, when he goes to Jerusalem for the Passover, that's where he chases out the money changers. That's the first Passover that's mentioned. Keeping in mind in the other Gospels, I think there's only just the final Passover mentioned. So we're going to call that the first year. Second year, he goes to Passover. It's kind of assumed from the timing of things, from people who know a lot more than I do, that this was for Passover. That's when he goes and he heals the invalid and has all these discussions with the Pharisees that he's the Son of God. Then the third year, this one is very much supposition, but when you look in early chapter 6, it says Passover was at hand, but that's surrounded by Jesus being in Galilee. And it says he stayed in Galilee. It doesn't specifically say he didn't go to Passover, but it just makes this little reference. So you have the idea that's the third Passover. Today, we're moving into the Feast of Tabernacles. So we've had all these mentions that happen in April. Now we're moving, we're going to go to Jerusalem, or Jesus and the disciples are, during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in October. And then next week, we'll talk about the Feast of Dedication they'll be at, which is in December. And then the following is Passover, the final Passover. And so one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is you just see these references all through. But it just strikes me that basically from chapter 7 on is 6 months. Everything before is roughly 2.5 years. And so just imagine when you take what we've talked about in these 5 chapters before, if you count chapter 1, there's just a little bit in there about his interaction with the disciples. All of that's 2.5 years. So imagine what we're missing when it says he performed many other signs. It says that a number of times in places. The things that we haven't seen. And and then just a question I have, just something to think about. We're not necessarily going to discuss this today, but as we go through these when we think about how this is set up, a question that keeps coming to my mind, and I'd like you to think about is, why did God through John choose this approach versus obviously the other Gospels are so written this way? Why spend all this time on Jerusalem and John? And it really doesn't. I mean, there's significant time, but nothing like in John. Why does John's focus so much on Jesus' teachings? I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, we want that, but I mean, John is just so different in the approach. And why in these first 5 chapters or 6 chapters, those particular events does he seem to focus on? Out of 2.5 years, these are the ones he focuses on. Most are different than are not seen in the other Gospels. Just something to think about as we go through things. So that's a quickie overview there. We start 7. 7 starts in Galilee. We're still there. We're going to go to Judea area. Most of the time I'll say Jerusalem, but it's the Judea area too. Apparently for the final time. Now, some of the other Gospels may fill us in different, so that's not to say that he didn't make another trip, but this is what John records. This is also, we'll see, Jesus' first time back in Jerusalem since he left in chapter 5, where it says they wanted to kill him. Opposition had grown to that point where they openly are threatening him. So, starting in 7:1, we're not going to read all this. We'll just skim through real quick. Jesus tells the disciples, he says he won't go to Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So he's very aware of this threat. He's staying there. So we had the Feast of Booths, Tabernacles, which I've mentioned. And interesting little side note here. I read this a bunch of times, and I just assumed it was talking about the disciples didn't want him to. The disciples wanted him to go. They were telling him, nobody's going to know about this if everything's done in secret. You need to go there where the people are, basically, and do these things, and everybody will be able to see, and word will spread. It doesn't say all that, but you can kind of infer it. And Jesus says, no, it's not my time. But it doesn't say disciples, it says brothers. And I was telling Carol, I struggle with these things because I struggle in my cynicism. She's reading, the Daily Bible by Eflegard Smith. He says it's Jesus' brothers. Okay. Another commentary we're reading says it's Jesus' brothers. I look at it, I'm going, do you really know? Anyway, why? Maybe he's just saying his brothers, his disciples, but it doesn't really explain. But the idea that it was his physical brothers kind of makes sense, because when you read it, as we go to the next section, he sends them on because it's not his time. He tells them to go. I'm not going. It's not my time. Then two or three verses later, he heads out and he goes. Only he goes in secret. If you do see this as his physical brothers who had trouble believing in him and who he was, you could read this part where they kind of challenged him to go and make this well known as almost a taunt. That this is almost on the level of the wilderness of Satan tempting him. Man, you need to go. This is where the bright lights are. This is where the stage is. And so then he doesn't go. Then he decides to go, and he goes in secret, it says. So it kind of makes more sense that way, that it is, even whether it was his physical brothers or some who were challenging him, which the disciples did as well. They would get off track and challenge him to do things. So that's my possible explanation for why he kind of does a switch in direction there, where he tells them he's not going, and then he goes in secret. So he goes and he just kind of listens, and there's lots of things being said about him. Some people think he's a good person. Some people think maybe he might be the Messiah, and some are upset with him, think he's a heretic. The usual thing that comes up. And then about halfway through the feast, and it literally says this about the middle of the feast in verse 14. He comes out in the open. He goes up to the temple and begins to teach. And the Jews question how he can know so much. And he responds, "This isn't for me. It's from the Father above, he who sent me." And then it's just kind of funny to me how this is very quickly after he's out in the open, he just hits them straight out. "Why do you seek to kill me?" I mean, there's no transition. It's just, "Why do you seek to kill me?" And so it may seem out of the blue until you think about the last few chapters, that he stayed out of Jerusalem because they're trying to kill him. It's well known that they're trying to kill him. There's kind of a funny response by the crowd. He says, "He must have a demon. I mean, who's trying to kill you?" And one of the things as we go through this, again, we won't spend much time today, but there's different audiences here. There's the Pharisees. There's probably the Jews that live in Jerusalem, who are probably very involved with the Pharisees, intimidated, in fear, respect, whichever. And then you have these massive crowds that come from all over, who maybe haven't been in tune with all these things that have been said about Jesus, and they're just learning about him. And they hear him say, "Why are you trying to kill me?" And so it says the crowd wonders if he's a demon. And Jesus talks about Sabbath. I'm going to move on pretty quickly here. Talks about the Sabbath, and that was one of the reasons they're accusing him. And they say, "Well, you perform circumcisions on the Sabbath. Why is it any less? Why is it wrong to heal somebody completely on the Sabbath?" So they sought to arrest him, and this is in verse 30. But no one touched him because his hour had not come. Here's that phrase again. In spite of all this, many believed, in verse 31. And then 37, we come to the last day of the feast, the great day, verse 37. And the great day, I read over this until I was reading more about the festivals. I just assumed it was, the final day. Apparently in the Jewish festivals, in the Feast of the Tabernacles, that's 7 days. The 8th day is called the great day. So it ties in perfectly with, what's said here is totally accurate. And the 8th day is a day of purification. It's set aside. Let me see, find my notes here. It's a day of sacrifices, no work. And Jesus spoke again on this day. And you find out the people kind of ends up with the people are split. Many believe, some question him. Again, some want to arrest him. Then it switches to the Pharisees and priests again, and these officers come forth, and apparently they were supposed to bring Jesus, and the Pharisees say, "Why didn't you bring him? No, why didn't you bring him to us?" And they say, "No one speaks like him." So even they are just amazed. And that's where you have the second mention of Nicodemus. The Pharisees are just really enraged and ready to arrest him, to kill him. And Nicodemus speaks up, and he says, in verse 51, "Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does?" That's the only thing that we see from Nicodemus. So in one respect, we really don't know where he's at yet. But you kind of get an indication that maybe this is a person who doesn't want to come out as a follower of Jesus, but he's seeking to protect him. And so that ends up kind of stalling the whole thing, and Jesus leaves again. So I think it's kind of the evolution of Nicodemus. You can see that he has become at least a semi-disciple, but he's not quite ready for everybody to know it yet. And when we get to chapter 19, I think we're going to see how things change. And quick question before we jump into our readings. Why was Jesus so careful to avoid dangerous situations? On the one hand, you've got these kind of mysterious little statements that are said, like I just read. I think it was back in my last page. They wanted to arrest him. It's just from the narrators from John. They wanted to arrest him, but his time had not come. Now, I'm sure the Pharisees weren't sitting there, oh, we shouldn't touch him because his time hasn't come. That's an observation from John. Well, if there's this kind of protection on Jesus, if you want to call it that, that's the way it almost sounds, then why does Jesus stay away? Why? Yeah, okay. So why does he choose to stay away? Why does he even tell his disciples, no, I don't want to go there because they're trying to kill me? Lawrence said he is God after all. So the rest of you get that. So he does have some protection. Jen?
I was going to say, because he's God, God at other places hardens people's hearts, which I've kind of come to semi-understand is he knows how they're going to react in a certain situation, and it calls it God hardens their heart. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So what if he's avoiding situations where if he put those people in them, their heart would be hardened differently, or then? Yeah, that's a good question. I thought I had more things to say, and then I got up here and was like, wait, hold on.
That's good. It's nice to know somebody else is as confused as I am. No, you're not that confused. That's a good thought. Good thought. Gary?
Well, I don't know the answer to the question, but I will offer there was already several, being familiar with the story, we know that there are several opportunities for violence to erupt. Mm-hmm. And in fact, actually does happen on the night before the crucifixion. So I think Jesus is very aware of this, not only because of his mission, but also because, like Lawrence has pointed out, I mean, after all, he already knows what's going to happen and even when. And that's the other part of the thing. It's not his time, because his time is that Passover when it's his time. He's the Passover lamb. Nothing can happen before that time until he's ready. That's the only insight I have on it.
Very good. Thank you. I just find it striking that it says it's almost like he's responding out of fear that he's staying away. But it could be, well, I mean, obviously we know it's going to be on his timing, God's timing. But he doesn't even go to Passover the one year because they threatened to kill him.
Perhaps he doesn't want to make a big production yet, you know, and he knows when he's going to die. He knew that before the foundation of the earth. But he also is scripting this whole thing, and it's not in the script to cause a big commotion yet.
I think that kind of ties in where Jen was going, in the idea that, which is where I've kind of come to be on it, it's truly, if it's not his time, it's not going to happen. He is God, and God the Father is controlling everything. But if he allowed himself to be in certain situations, there would be a big commotion. There might be another massive miracle that wasn't part of the message that he was trying to do. Just thought I'd throw that in. Okay. Then we have the Samaritan woman. Excuse me, not Samaritan woman, the woman caught in adultery. Only comment I'll make on that, there's so much you could spend on this. 2 comments. One, I think it's interesting that the oldest leave first. So Jesus asked them, let him without sin cast first stone, and the oldest leave first. I think you could make a whole discussion out of that. There's also, these young people are so impetuous. And then it's just another example of Jesus' compassion for those who are hurting and in sin, which is in sin, all of us. Samaritan woman, you could go through this, the different people that he finds, a tax collector and other, So what we're going to do now is, got a couple volunteers I hog-tied into reading. We're going to read, if we have time, we'll read the rest of chapter 8. We may only do the first section. It depends on comments. So the first section is 12 through 30. And Carrie has agreed to be Jesus. And Paul has agreed to be Pharisee. So if you guys wouldn't mind reading this.
Test. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.
So the Pharisee said to him, You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true.
Jesus answered, Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of 2 people is true. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me.
They said to him, therefore, Where is your Father?
Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also.
These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come.
So he said to them again, I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come.
So the Jews said, Will he kill himself, since he says, Where I am going, you cannot come?
He said to them, You are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins.
So they said to him, Who are you?
Jesus said to them, Just what I have been telling you from the beginning. I have much to say with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him.
As he was saying these things, many believed in him.
Thank you. Now you see, we could spend 3 weeks on this little section. Couple of comments, and then we'll let any thoughts you guys have. In verse 24, mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Jesus seems to stress over and over this idea. He says, I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. It's this idea that he came to save, not to condemn. You're in your sins, believe in me, and you'll be saved. Then, I don't even know how to keep this short. There's all these great lessons. Danny's done a bunch of them on I am. And we have another I am here. I am the light of the world. And I've mentioned that there's other I ams besides the metaphors in John. This is an interesting passage to me because there's at least 5 more that are the Greek word, which is the one that everyone points to, means the I am God. Ego of me. I'm sorry. At home, I always say Lego of my ego. But anyway, I can't. So I had to stop and think, okay, how do I say that? But in 12, he says, I am the light of the world. In 18, he says, I am the one who bears witness of myself. That's ego of me. 23, I am from above. I am not of this world. That's ego of me. Unless you believe I am he. In 24 and 28, he says, when you've lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. I mean, it's just rich all the way through here. Before we go too far, though, I want to just caution, and this was a caution I had to look up for myself. I am is not exclusive to God. It is it's a phrase that God has adopted, but you can find passages all over the New Testament that uses ego me that's not referring to Jesus. So you have to use a little caution when you jump in with these passages, and always, you look at context and you can see these, because there's places where it'll say I'm going to so and so, and that's not ego of me. But like, for instance, and since I've mentioned it in Luke, when Zacharias says I'm an old man, that's ego of me. Peter says it. This almost sounds Star Wars. I am the one you're looking for. I am not. I am not the disciple you're looking for. Okay, so let's see here. Any thoughts before we read the next section? Did these prompt anything? Just anything in this passage? If not, we'll jump to Gary and Cheryl. And if you have one, you think of one, we'll have a little time at the end. Let's see.
Testing. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
They answered him, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?
Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are offspring of Abraham. Yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I've seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your father.
They answered him, Abraham is our father.
Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You were doing the works your fathers did.
They said to him, we were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God.
Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I come from God and I am here. I came out of my own accord, but he sent me. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God.
The Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?
Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death.
The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be?"
Jesus answered, If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, He is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad.
So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?"
Jesus said to them, Truly, truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am.
So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple.
Thank you. Both, all four of you. Very, very well done. Any comments? Off the top of your head, you're going to get. What do you think of some of the arguments being thrown at Jesus?
Now that I've reread that, he could have said, I know Abraham, you don't. I was there. You weren't. But he didn't do that. He let that teaching moment stretch out. I found that very fascinating. I don't think I've noticed it before. He could have pretty well put a cap on this conversation, much like I would do, saying, you don't know what you're talking about. I was there before Abraham was. And that would have been all that needed to be said. It would have been the same thing. But look what happened instead. He let that just go and just kept.
That's a good point. He does that. He does it a lot when you see these sections where they ask a question, not necessarily here, but they ask a question, and he doesn't answer it. But he uses that to broaden it into something much bigger. I find it really fascinating, just their technique, what they're accusing him of. Things like even the first section, and this is in the 33. We're from Abraham. We've never been enslaved. I mean, it's what we do when we have something we don't like, and we just can't quite come up with an art why we don't like it. Yeah, well, your mom. Anyway, and the one at the end, I absolutely love. He says he's new Abraham, and he says, "You're not even 50 years old. If he was 60, would he have known Abraham?" I just think it's funny that they picked 50. I mean, you can see they're just grasping,
Deal with the Samaritan.
Yeah.
Where'd that come from?
Well, some people, one thing I read was equating him with a heretic.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gary asked, what's the deal with the Samaritan? They accuse him of being a Samaritan. And one thing I read, and it kind of fits, that they're accusing him of being a heretic. Because for the Jews, a Samaritan they were heretics.
What about we were not born of sexual immorality? I mean, is that a reference to him?
I read that. I kind of wonder how public that would be. I'm sorry. Thank you. Michelle, Michelle asked about the verse in 41. They said, we weren't born of sexual immorality, and there's no explanation. Is that a reference to the fact that Jesus was born of a virgin? That everybody knows Joseph isn't the father. Well, I'm not sure everybody knows that. That's why I wondered about that interpretation. So I'm really not sure, but it could be. But they just pull out all these things. Well, you must be a demon. You must be this. Well, you can't be this. And they keep just pulling out these things that have really nothing to do with what's going on. But so you think they're crazy, but then you go, well, I mean, what do I do? You know, it's when you're desperate to make your point, you start pulling out all the strange stuff. And we could go back to various things for that. I hope to do in future weeks more of these readings and have more time for discussion. I keep saying that, but so I wanted to experiment a little bit with that this week. But I do want to leave on. We have another I am statement here before Abraham. I am, but to me, this all boils down to the question is this just all a big? I'll get right to you, Lauren. Is this all a big theological debate? Is Jesus just entering into this debate that I am God, I am the Messiah, and they're giving me all these objections. So you're having all this back and forth, the pros and cons. And it's a theological discussion, or is it something more? And I'll come back to that.
And their theology was that righteousness was inherited. And their statement that they were not born of sexual immorality is asserting that they are indeed the long-suffering offspring of Abraham. And they believe that because they are, that they're okay.
That's a great point. Love it. Thanks. I hadn't seen that anywhere. Didn't think of that. That's good. So, Gary?
This whole section starts with the Jews who had believed him. Those are the people he's talking to. Those are the people saying these things. They already, at some level, believe that he is special, that he's the one, the prophet. And yet they're in their disbelief or their lack of belief or their growing belief, they're still struggling with this. I think that's one of the reasons why he expanded the teaching opportunity, but still, they're being pretty rough on him.
Yeah.
And he's being
He's
pretty
being
rough
pretty
on
rough
them.
right back, isn't he? Yeah. Your father's the devil. You're a liar. He's pretty, we have to wrap it. That's what I think. I think one of the reasons he's at these feasts, he knows what the Pharisees are going to think. Not that he's not trying to reach the Pharisees, he's trying to reach everyone. But you've got people from all over in different places that are hearing all of this, and he uses this as teaching. So it mixed in with this being rough and making these statements are these promises, and I just wrote down a few. In 7, he says, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water, and explains the Spirit. So if you're hearing that, if you believe in him, most Jews would know that's from the Old Testament prophecy. I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows will have the light of life. In the midst of these, your father, Satan, and you, he's revealing these promises. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And he ties that to sin directly, mentions it, which everyone can relate to. You will never see death in 51. And these are just peppered throughout. And so I think there's a real message of hope and comfort brought in here, that people are wondering, questioning, debating, but he keeps coming back, and he does strike them where they're at, and he does challenge them. But he's mixing in this message of hope all the way through it and comfort. Thank you. Next week, chapter 9 and 10.